Hi there, I'm Chris Hansen, and I'll be speaking with you today about a subject that many parents find to be a challenge in homeschooling, and that is writing. Specifically, I'll be speaking about creative writing and creativity, but many of the things that I'm discussing here, I believe, can be applied to writing in general with your kids. As I've learned more about this subject and talked to parents about it and had many conversations, I've really come to see that this is a very intimidating subject for a lot of parents to teach. It may be that you don't know how to teach the subject. You yourself don't feel like you're a good writer. You don't really know what curriculum to use. Also, many kids have a very difficult time with writing, and it can be very difficult and challenging to motivate your kids in a homeschooling setting to do this subject. And I found working a little bit with kids across the learning spectrum that as your kids' learning needs become more a challenge in certain areas, this subject can be even more difficult. And so I am thankful that I'm able to speak and share some of the things that I've learned in my time working with people on this. The first thing I'll say is that it is possible. One thing that I have seen again and again is that when parents are given the right tools to teach this subject and have the right attitude, it can be a really positive experience and really rewarding as well. So there's hope, and I encourage you to hold on to hope as you go through homeschooling, specifically in getting your child to open up, to write, to share words, and to speak their thoughts and what's going on inside them to you and others. It's a worthwhile thing to do, and while it can be difficult, I do believe the rewards are more than worth it. So let me begin by actually introducing myself a little bit better and why I'm actually speaking to you today. I never believed or even imagined I would be doing a podcast like this. If I look back to about 15 years ago, this was not on my radar at all. We were starting the process of homeschooling our kids, and we have homeschooled our 3 children through high school. But professionally, what I was doing was I was working with professional storytellers. I started working with filmmakers, screenwriters, directors, and producers. And then as the years went on, I started branching out and working with novelists and graphic novelists and doing consulting with a number of other kinds of storytellers in different fields. And it was about 5 years ago when my wife, who was homeschooling our kids, who were our oldest at that time, were in junior high school, and she was sharing how there was a great need for a creative writing curriculum. And so she encouraged me to take the things that I was doing and my training material that I was doing with professionals and to put it into something that a homeschool student could do. The outcome of this is a creative writing curriculum that I wrote called A Pirate's Guide to the Grammar of Story. And I'll get into this a little bit later, but what this opened me up to was the larger homeschool community. After I released this, a number of people started inviting me to speak at conferences and do trainings. And at that point, I'd never worked with parents before with their kids. And this allowed me to have just probably hundreds of conversations with homeschooling parents and educators and a whole world that I never worked with before. And in a sort of a backwards way, I started to see what the needs were in this community and how this creative writing curriculum I had written actually met these needs somewhat accidentally. And actually, it's not an accident. It's coming out of the work that I've done because I've worked with writers for so long. The thing that surprised me, though, is that the problems that a professional writer is faced with in writing a story are in fact the exact same problems that a junior high kid has in writing a story as well, that they're really essentially the same thing. The heart of that thing, the thing that both the professional and all of us struggle with creative writing, is the blank page. Imagine someone sits you down, a teacher in a classroom, and gives you a blank piece of paper and says, write a story. Write anything you want. You can write about anything, just write it down. Now, on one hand, this seems generous. This seems kind. You can write whatever you want. It's kind of free. Be creative. Write whatever you want. But in actual fact, for most people, this is one of the most terrifying things that they can be told to do. It's utterly overwhelming, because what are you going to write about? You could write about millions of things, but what's the one thing that you're actually going to write about? Creativity, I've found, actually works the exact opposite way. Instead of giving people kind of utter freedom, creativity flourishes when you're given very tight constrictions and boundaries. Stories are very complex things. Even though they seem simple when you listen to them, if you watch a movie or read a book, it kind of feels like it just kind of came out of the author just like that. But when you understand that it takes writers years, sometimes decades, to write a novel or make a movie, you can start to see there's so many moving parts going on below the surface. And this is one of the challenges with writing in general. When we have our kids sit down to write, it can be very intimidating to them. It can be overwhelming, it can be daunting, and many kids, they just shut down. They just don't function anymore. And this is all too often how writing is taught. And it's really a tragedy, because it doesn't have to be that way. Because the approach that I find that works very well is actually pretty simple and straightforward. It's giving somebody a very narrow, specific thing and asking them a question. So, for example, you can ask your child, if you were a sea creature, what sort of sea creature would you be? Would you be a dolphin? Would you be a shark? Would you be a whale? Would you be a salmon? Or would you be a sea monster? In asking this, I'm asking them a very specific question about being a sea creature, and then giving them a small limited list of creatures that they can choose from. Next, you can then take the answer that they have and ask deeper questions about it. For example, where does the dolphin like to swim? Does it swim in the waves of the ocean? Does it live in the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean? Then you can ask other questions, like what kind of food does the dolphin like to eat in the Pacific Ocean after it swims in the waves? Then you can ask, does it have any friends? Does it swim alone, or is it with a group of other dolphins? And in this way, you're giving your child very specific things to answer that is very limited and within their ability to be creative, instead of a blank slate of saying you can write whatever you want to write. And this is my general philosophy around teaching creativity, and specifically creative writing. And therefore, this creative writing curriculum I've designed is structured somewhat in that way. What I've done is I've taken writing a story, and broken it down into a number of smaller pieces. These pieces are what I call the grammar of story. They're things that you're somewhat familiar with, like setting and rules and symbols and characters. Things you might have heard before, like beginning, middle, and end, heroes and villains, transformation, character arc, mystery, connections, stakes, ticking clocks, and so on. All told, the workbook consists of 26 of these items, these elements of story, and turns each one into its own separate exercise. At the same time, there's a pirate story, which is why the title of the book's The Pirate's Guide to the Grammar of Story, that is woven in and throughout these exercises. So the stories of this notorious pirate named Captain Yager Lafasa, who captures your child and brings him aboard his ship and invites them to go on a quest with them on a treasure hunt to find where X marks the spot. And the story is woven in and out of the exercises, and the exercises themselves are involving your child in this larger pirate story quest. It was done simply to make this exercise of creative writing fun and interesting, and also to demonstrate the exercises, these elements of story, through the fictional story of these pirates and its crew of talking monkeys and all of the adventures that they go on through the course of this story. As I designed the curriculum, I drew upon my experience of being a homeschooling dad and the other parents that I interacted with at our co-op groups. One thing that I did not want this book to be is to be really teacher intensive. I wanted this to be something that a parent could hand to their child and have them do, and not be intimidating or have a big teacher's guide or a lot of background or explanation or something that the parent would need to spend hours doing background and research on. Instead, I designed it to be something just very easy to use, very intuitive, where you could just simply open the book and start work with it. And so as a result, it's something that parents and their kids can do alongside each other, where you don't have to be teaching this. It's just almost like a journey the two of you can go on together. I wanted this subject to be fun. And that's ultimately my goal with this, is that I believe that if you can get kids to enjoy writing and to engage with it, it will cause them to continue to want to write. I'm describing this because I want to give you a picture of what this workbook is. So imagine a curriculum that's 300 some odd pages long, broken into 26 different exercises with different lessons, with a pirate story woven out, where each of the exercises are very directive in the kind of way that I was describing earlier. If you were a sea creature, what kind of sea creature would you be? And these questions build upon each other so that one after another, that your kids are adding to what they've done before and creating a lot of what I call raw material for stories that they would want to tell. Now, when I released this book, I really had no idea what audience it would find and who would find it helpful. And many have, but there's been one group of people who have found it very helpful. And in fact, they're the biggest fans of it. And that's why I'm speaking to at this conference for homeschooling kids across the learning spectrum. What I've did not expect at all is that parents of kids with learning disabilities, kids on the autistic spectrum, and other kids that are not your traditional student that I was thinking of are the ones that are finding this workbook very valuable. And I didn't understand this at all. I really did not set out to write a book like that, nor did I can really understand why it was. And so I was getting all this feedback back from parents who were thanking me for this. And so I started having conversations with them about it and trying to understand why it was. So for the rest of this talk, I would like to share some of the things that I've learned in this, and I hope some of it might be encouraging to you as you go forward with your kids in your own specific situation. The first thing that I kept hearing again and again is that this workbook wasn't overwhelming to their kids. And this was a bit strange to me because I found that the curriculum is actually fairly rigorous. It takes quite a while to work through, and it does require a lot of the student. And this disconnect for me was really because I really did not understand what being a parent of a child on the spectrum was like. To quote one parent, she described it as this. She said, "Our world is one PTSD episode after another. It's very stressful all the time. Sometimes homeschooling the special needs child, even though it is the best thing for them, is very hard. It's like being in a battle and educating our child and being a therapist and being a mom. What's helpful to us is simplicity. I also find it helpful when things are not timed, with no deadlines. What she was describing in the workbook is that the format of it allows kids to take small bite-sized pieces. Even though the workbook is broken into exercises, there's really no beginning and ending. You can just start the exercise and keep on going through it. And when your child's tired or done or has a meltdown or something interrupts or something like that, you can simply stop. There's no, like writing an essay of this kind of large task you're trying to do, that you need to keep on pressing through with it until it's done. As one parent described her son, she said he struggles with self-esteem and confidence, and finishing a lesson or exercise builds his confidence. And with this curriculum, he can decide how much he can do and be successful. She then went on to describe how if her son can't finish something, he feels defeated. And it's quite pronounced. He can act like he's losing a limb. He'll have a meltdown, diarrhea, even something as simple as not finishing a lesson. With pirates, they aren't even lessons, just exercises. It allows him to decide just to do 2 or 3 things or push through more of them to get through to the story. And by the story, she's referring to the pirate story that's woven throughout the workbook, where there's a section of story followed by questions and then more story and more questions. And for certain kids, the story is the reward. And while we're on the subject of rewards, this was very interesting to me when one parent said, essentially as a 42-year-old, she grew up without rewards. But today, she feels all things need rewards. Every activity, every book, every app is about earning something, stars, points, leveling up. And she's found that this is too much for her autistic son, that he gets unfocused, but then his focus is then solely based on getting the prize and not the work itself. And she's found her son will just do just the bare minimum, just enough to get the prize. Where she's describing, because the prize in this curriculum is the story itself, which is woven in and out of the exercises, the rewards is kind of integrated into the very work itself. And the other unique thing about this reward is that it's in their mind. For other than the cover of the book, there's no illustrations or drawings inside the book at all. Most curriculums have characters and drawings and stars and doodles and things like that. And as a parent told me, their kids are overstimulated as it is. They're inundated with stuff on their phones, on their computer, on their television screens. She said it can be a challenge going into the store because there's just so much stimulation there for them. So in a curriculum, anything extra is too much. So what she found valuable is that her son was able to visualize the characters in the story because out of the written words. And the whole process is streamlined and simple. There's no teacher's guide at all. There's no education or training. There's no big section that goes into background. It's simply a story of a notorious pirate with a peg leg and a crew of talking monkeys who have taken your kid onto their ship and having them go through all these different exercises about telling stories as they go on this quest. The pattern is pretty subtle. It's below the surface. But the exercise being taught, say the exercise on setting. So a setting in a story is the place and events around where the story takes place. And so the pirate story around the setting is describing the setting of the pirate story. You're on a pirate ship out in the sea. And it's describing what the ship is and what the sea is and how you got there and where you're going. So to sum this up, what I found parents saying is that their kids need curriculum. They need work that is something that their kids can do, that's not overlong or overwhelming or taxing them. It's something they can accomplish, that they can finish little bite-sized pieces of that can build their confidence. And in doing this, it doesn't resort to bribes or rewards or meaningless stars or points or things that have no meaning at all. But the reward is the very thing itself. And one of the rewards of fiction, of stories, is being transported into a different world, meeting new characters, going and experiencing things that you yourself would never do in your own real life. And we get to experience this when we watch a movie or read a book. And we want to connect this with our kids when they're writing a story. We want them to have the same experience of traveling to a different world. But this time it's a world that they're interacting with. And this is one of the things that video games, I think, have a real advantage over. And I think why a lot of kids, especially boys on the autistic spectrum, gravitate towards games. There's a huge desire to be creative, to act and to function in a world without the limitations that they experience in this world. So in the process of getting your kid to enjoy writing and to enjoy creative writing, it's doing the same thing, but it is more work. It's much easier to just pick up a game console and to play in existing game world like Minecraft or something. It's more difficult to do that with a pen and a paper and something that they have to then create. And so hopefully this pirate story and the questions that relate around it can help bridge that gap and make that something easier for kids to enter into. And this leads me to the second point that I heard numerous parents talk about, is that this curriculum bridges the gap that most other curriculums do not. One of the moms I talked to is actually a curriculum reviewer for a publication. And so she gets just inundated with curriculum and has looked at numerous curriculums over her years. And she told me that moms of special needs kids tend to go through so many books just to find one thing that they find encourages the learning experience for their kids and encourages them to want to learn, and for the learning experience to be a good, positive experience that their kids want to do. One of the challenges in that is that most curriculum she's found has these big, what she calls gaps. And if I understand that correctly, it's where you're working on something, you're doing something, and the next step, the next thing they're asking your student to do is too big of a leap for them to comprehend. They can't do it. So like in math, it would be saying, what's 1 plus 1, 1 plus 2, 1 plus 3, 1 plus 4. That's very incremental learning. But if the question went from what's 1 plus 1, 1 plus 2, 1 plus 3 to 7 plus 9, that could be too big of a gap. And I don't think this is something that's a problem for just special need kids. I think this is a problem for all of us. Whenever we face a barrier or a wall or a chasm that's intimidating or too big than we think we can cross, we shut down. We may give up. We don't know what to do. But at some point, this is a level of scale. It's a level of how big the gaps are. For some kids, you can have fairly big steps and they can navigate that fairly well. So the challenge for many parents, all parents, is to find a curriculum and program that doesn't have gaps that are bigger than their kid can handle. And that's something that has been stated again and again by parents who have used the Pirate's Guide curriculum, is that it makes use of very small incremental baby steps and leading their kids by example. It's very directive. For example, I use the example of, if you're a sea creature, what would you be? This, or this. And what I've been told by numerous parents with kids on the autistic spectrum is that their kids have a very black-white nature. That they're the kind of kids that when they ask the time, they want to know that it's not 3 o'clock, but it's 3:01. And this oftentimes is the biggest block to these kids in being creative, is that they can be very literal. They can be so factual and focused on the factual that parents don't have any idea how to help them be creative. And my hope when I set out to do this wasn't just to put kids through some course, have them do work. My hope was that it actually helped them develop creativity. Because I've seen that creativity is something like a muscle, and that as you use it, as you work it out, it gets stronger. And this becomes an issue in areas of the arts where, say, for example, you say, to your child, let's draw something together. And they say what? And say, let's draw a tree. And they sit down to try to draw a tree, but they can't because it doesn't fit what they expect a tree to look like. And so they give up. That gap is too big for them. What I think is happening here is that creativity muscle isn't very strong. To go back to that blank piece of paper and write whatever you want that I started this conversation with, the reason why that's so intimidating for most of us is that our creativity muscle isn't strong enough to do something like that. Whereas our creativity muscle of choosing what kind of sea creature we would want to be, most of us have a muscle that could answer that question. I spoke with a parent that was sad that her son just can't play with things like Play-Doh. And even with Lego, she described her son would only create what the instructions said for him to do. And once he put that puzzle together, he'll be done. And so for her, it feels like pulling creativity out of him is impossible. But I think the real challenge here, what's going on, is really just describing the strength of a muscle and giving that muscle a chance to lift the weights that it's capable of lifting. And that's why this incremental learning, I think, is so important. To think of it like exercise is you start with the arm weight that your arm can carry. And you slowly over time build that up until your muscles get stronger and you can lift heavier and heavier weights. The same is true with creativity. So now here's something that I find really interesting. Professional storytellers struggle with these exact same things. Their muscles are not strong enough, they feel, as well. And I think that's because I found story to be one of the most complicated things that we as humans can do. In a sense, it's harder than rocket science. And so as I was working in this area, I spent years trying to find a way to break down story into smaller parts that would make it more manageable. This just made sense to me. When you have something very complicated, people break it down into the most simple, basic things and focus on those one at a time. That's essentially what we're doing in teaching kids English grammar. Things like nouns and predicates and subject and adjectives and clauses and all these really scary, terrifying words that we come up with in grammar are really just these small, simple, basic things that make up sentences. So my goal was to make story as simple and as straightforward and gentle as possible for everyone. And in doing this, I inadvertently made it accessible to kids with special needs, kids on the autistic spectrum, kids that have attention disorder, kids that are not professionals. And that's the great irony, I think, is that a problem that I found professionals having is the exact same problem that all of us have. Your kids aren't any different than kids who are academically gifted and excelling in their school. We all need a gentle, slow, straightforward, simple path to the destinations we want to go. As I've talked with parents, it seems like all of them, no matter where their kid is at, how many needs their kids has or doesn't have, they want to see their kids progress. And sometimes it just feels like they're not moving at all, they're not developing at all. And I just want to encourage you and say it is possible. And I've seen it happen in this area of creativity. There was one mom who shared with me just a really wonderful story that was just so encouraging for them as well as for me, that their son, autistic son, was very literal. At the beginning of the process of doing this creative writing, his muscles just weren't very strong. And when he was asked to answer a question, he would just give a single word and be done with it. She said at the beginning it was literally like pulling teeth to get him to answer. But now that they've gone through it, it's not. She described how her husband had even noticed the progression and had said, wow, to see how his writing has developed and become easier for him. He's gotten to the point of saying, if I do this, and if I do this, and if I do this, and I put it all together, it actually sounds good. And I think that's the key, is that their son was the one recognizing that he was doing this. He understood his muscles were weak. He understood he couldn't do this. And now that when he saw himself being able to do it, he was being encouraged. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not, the progress here is very small, but for them and their family, that any movement at all was really significant. And it really came home to them this past Thanksgiving. Her mom was describing how every Thanksgiving, everyone in their family puts things they're thankful for on what they call a thankful tree. And in the past, her son's items on the thankful tree were just food. But this year, she said he put down more descriptive things. And in that, they could really tell that he'd come a long way. And so to summarize the point here is I don't think it's particularly anything to do with my curriculum or anything other than it's just using a tool of small, incremental baby steps that gradually gets harder and enables them to win, enables them to do it, to keep going, to not get lost, to not get stuck at the edge of a cliff where there's a gap that's too big for them, where they just give up. My third and final point that I heard in talking to parents, that kids with learning disabilities, and this is what I heard, that they can be very negative and critical towards themselves. I spoke with a number of parents about their kids' self-hate as they described it. The parents would describe how their kids knew that they had problems. They knew that they didn't fit in. They knew they had disabilities. They knew they had limitations. They feel bad about themselves, and their schoolwork and some curriculums just reinforce that feeling that they are broken, that they don't have the ability to do these things. In describing this, one mom described to me saying, that's why self-paced things are very helpful for us. So many things in our life are just rush, rush, rush. It's so rare and so valuable to be able to open up a book and just go through it slowly for as long as he's able, and to close it at any time. The net effect of this is that it reassures us that this is not going to be one more thing that my son is going to have to feel bad about as well. It's depressing when I can't get my kid to do his work because I've had a late night with them, or any of the other things that happen in our day-to-day life. Chris, you have to understand that they are going through meltdowns all day long, and that the thing that you've created isn't overwhelming. It doesn't have sensory overload, colored pictures, graphs, and charts. All the other grammar books, all of these have lists, memorize these rules, do this, do that, here's this, and all of it's overwhelming. Your program is easier, simpler, and stress-free. Almost every kid on the autistic spectrum has sensory issues, and they get overwhelmed. They can't take too many words at a time, or too much to do at any one time, or too much to understand at any one time. There's so much information thrown at them all the time. There's tests and quizzes and reviews and grades and scores and assessments, none of that which I do. But what you have them do in Pirate's Guide is practicing what they're learning by doing the very exercises themselves. As she was describing this, I was thinking to myself, I feel that way a lot of the time. And how many things are pulling on me, how I'm rushing and feeling graded and assessed and tested. And if I was honest, I would have meltdowns a lot of the time. There's so much to do and not enough time to do it. I feel like I'm not doing a good enough job. I long for things that are simple and quiet and stress-free. And I don't know if I can say I did that in creating this curriculum. But the point I want to make with this is I think we all as parents want to stress to our kids and to communicate to our kids that they're not broken. They're not a problem. All that self-hate and criticism is just something I think we all wish we could magically pull out of our kids and throw a billion, trillion, quadrillion miles away under the sea in a galaxy super far away so that it never comes back. But the unfortunate reality seems like these things are getting worse. So what do we do as parents? How do we help our kids? How do we help ourselves in this? I think one way is simply being together. I think this is one reason why homeschooling can be such a gift to kids and ourselves. We get to spend a lot of time with each other. And this is going to have the good along with the bad. There's going to be the times of fights and meltdowns where you're going to have to leave the grocery store with all your items in the cart. But there's also the sweet, tender, wonderful, magical times. Whatever that looks like for you and your kids. It may be singing a song together or dancing a silly dance around the house. It might be bedtime stories or going on a roller coaster and screaming your lungs out together. Whatever it is for you and your family and your kids, I encourage you to do that more, to focus on it more. In doing these things, we're saying to our kids, I want to be with you. I like you. You're not broken. You're not a problem. And I hope your homeschool, your actual schoolwork time can be the same. And all too often, it's not. All too often, it's a fight, a battle of wills. Too much stimulation and overfocus on prizes and rewards that don't really affirm who your kid really is at the heart. But it doesn't have to be that way. There are many examples of wonderful experience parents and their kids share in homeschooling together. And when I set out to write this curriculum, it was my hope that parents and kids would do it together, that this would be something they did side by side, and that it could be one of these special moments that you and your child share together. I didn't want this to be something that a parent just gave their kid and had them do in quiet, alone, separate. I wanted parents to do this and answer the questions themselves too. You can share your answers with each other. You can share your characters and all the things that these exercises draw out of each other. And so if you do, try it out. Have fun with it. Just enjoy it together with your kids and your family. So these are the 3 things that I've learned in talking with numerous parents about their kids and their problems and their needs, and how in some small way this creative writing curriculum has helped them. The first is to do something that they can do, be it just a small exercise, just bite-sized pieces that they can finish and accomplish. Something that's not overwhelming or overlong or overtaxing or overstimulating. Something they can start and finish and feel good about finishing. The second is to do something that does baby steps, small incremental steps that don't create gaps or bridges or walls that block their progress, that stop them from getting to the goal or end or across this chasm that they think they never can get across. We need to build bridges for them. We need to make things easy for them to accomplish so that they continue and don't give up or give up hope. And third, do things that say that they're valuable, that I care about you. Things that counteract this poison of negativity and criticism and self-doubt and self-hatred. Things that say, you did this, here's what you've done, here's what you've made, here's what we've done together, here's who you are, and this is how I view you. So I thank you for taking the time to listen through this 40 minutes of me sharing these things that I've learned, and I've learned for myself. These are all lessons that I need, that my kids need. So be encouraged. It is possible. And know that the work you're doing, homeschooling and teaching your kids, is very valuable. Keep going. Don't give up hope.